Welcome everyone coming in. Welcome to our second webinar on this Gender Action Plus webinar series, Let's Talk, Let's Act, Discrimination in Danish Higher Education. We will get going in just a moment, but as you're coming in, feel free to already use the chat to say hi and maybe share where you're calling in from, which city, country, university, so we already have an idea of who's in this room with us. And then we will just wait a minute until everyone is here. Welcome everyone, to those of you just coming in. Welcome to the webinar. We will start in a moment and you're all invited to already drop in the chat where you're calling in from, which city, which country, which university, so we know who's here. I can see the numbers going up. People are still joining us, so I'll just wait another minute until we start. All right, then I would say let's start. Again, warm welcome to our second webinar today on this Gender Action Plus webinar series, Let's Talk, Let's Act, Addressing Discrimination in Danish Higher Education. My name is Bontu Guschke. I'm a researcher and also a facilitator and a consultant in the area of anti-discrimination and diversity in academia. Specifically, I did quite a lot of research on the intersection of racist and sexist discrimination at Danish universities. I am, however, not primarily here as a researcher today. I'm here as a moderator for this webinar series, so I will be the one guiding you and guiding us through this webinar today, and I am very much looking forward to that. I'm here together with Molly Okino, and Molly, I'll just give you a moment to also introduce yourself.
Thanks so much, Bonto. Yes, hi, I'm Molly Okino. I'm a diversity and inclusion special consultant in the gender equality team. I'm here at the University of Southern Denmark. My background is in gender studies and social science, and I'm currently finishing my PhD at Roskilde University. I'm here together with my colleague, Liv Eisner-Petersen, who is head of the gender equality team here at SDU. Liv, could you wave? Yep, and we are the project partners in the Gender Action Plus project together with the Ministry of Higher Education and Science. And we're very excited to be here today organizing this very timely seminar, the webinar series together with Bonto. So thank you.
Thank you, Molly. And again, warm welcome from the three of us, Molly, Liu, and myself. We are also here today with two amazing speakers, Ea Utoft and Anke Lipinski. And I will introduce the two of you a bit later, but also already warm welcome to both of you. Before I get to you, I want to say a couple of words of what brings us here today. Of course, the main issue that brings us here today is speaking about discrimination in Danish higher education. It's an issue that is not only highly relevant, but also discussed more and more, not least since the Me Too movement started spreading into Danish academia in 2020. Of course, it's been an issue long before that, and we hope it continues to be a priority at Danish universities. In fact, just this year, we are celebrating 150 years of women's access to universities in Denmark. And while this is, of course, something to celebrate, we also know that these 150 years have been accompanied by continuous struggles for gender equality in academia. In fact, just last year, the research institute VIVE published a report on sexism at Danish universities that was commissioned by the Ministry of Higher Education and Science as a response to the Me Too movement hitting Danish academia. And the findings of this VIVE report show that scholars, and particularly junior scholars, continuously experience sexist and also other forms of discrimination in Danish higher education institutions. So also after 150 years, I would say there is certainly still a lot to talk about and also a lot to act on. And that's how this idea for this webinar series came about. Let's talk, let's act, addressing discrimination in Danish higher education. As I mentioned before, this webinar series is headed by the gender equality team at SDU, so Leo and Molly, and it's part of the Danish National Impact Plan in the EU Gender Action Plus project. It's a project that some of you might have heard about. It's an EU project consisting of partners from 22 EU member states that are working on the coordination of gender equality and inclusiveness objectives in the new ERA, the European Research Area. So really thinking very broadly, but then also very specifically about how to foster equality and inclusion in higher education across the EU. And as part of that, we think it's very important to talk about discrimination in higher education and to do that from an intersectional perspective and to stick true to that, to really speak about this from an intersectional perspective. We're having not just one, but actually 5 webinars, a whole series. Last week, we had our first session where we spoke about racism and racist discrimination. Today, we will speak about sexism and gender inequalities. In the following weeks, we will then discuss anti-queerness and anti-transness, neurodiversity and ableism, and last but not least, in our final webinar, we will talk about the overarching question of how do we actually implement meaningful and intersectional DEI work in universities. That's the overall plan for the next weeks, but to zoom in a bit more on today, we are very much looking forward to our session today on sexism, sexual harassment, and gender inequalities in higher education. I'm super happy to see that we're up at 78 participants in this online space right now from more than 55 different universities and research institutes across Europe and even beyond that. That's really, really cool to see. We're very happy about that. And yeah, thank you to everyone who is here with us today. What can you expect? And also importantly, how can you contribute? In a moment, we're going to give our 2 speakers, Ea and Anke, about 15 minutes each for a brief input that we asked them to prepare relating to the theme of today's session. And after that, we will have time for a discussion with them. On the one hand, to dive a bit deeper into understanding problems of sexism, sexual harassment, and gender inequalities in higher education. And then on the other hand, also to discuss what can we do against this? Because as we say in the title to the seminar, we need to talk, but we also really need to act. For this discussion, we would love to get your questions, your comments, and your insights. And for this, we will be using the Q&A function that you can see at the bottom of your screen where it says Q&A. This is where you can post your questions. You can do this at any point. So you don't have to wait until we get to the discussion. If you already have a question while you're hearing Anke or Ea speak, post it in the Q&A. Molly will be the one monitoring that and then bringing your questions into the discussion. We want to make you aware that we do not tolerate any form of discrimination. So if there are any comments or questions that we perceive as discriminatory or hostile towards our speakers, we will not pass that on. But apart from that, we will do our best to bring in as many of your questions as possible. So I will be leading us into the discussion, share some of my questions, but then we will also bring in your questions as we go along. And we will also make sure to save some extra time for more Q&A questions in the last 15 minutes. So again, please don't use the chat, don't use the raise hand button, use the Q&A, and then we'll find your questions. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our first amazing speaker, and that is Dr. Anke Lipinski. I actually still remember that when I met Anke for the first time, she was presenting some data on sexual harassment and sexual violence from the UNICEF project that I think we will also hear a bit about today. And I thought, this is exactly what we need. I'm so glad that we have this data and this research, and I'm very curious what will develop out of this in the next years. So I'm really happy that we have Anke with us again today to share some important insights and developments from this research. To tell you a bit more about her, Dr. Anke Lipinski is a senior researcher at the Geses Leibniz Institute for the Social Sciences in Cologne, Germany, in the CEFS team, CEFS standing for the Center of Excellence Women and Science. She is a PI of the quantitative survey of UNICEF, and her research focuses on equality and gender relations in academia, including gender-based violence, and also evaluation and research methods. She participated in several European Commission expert groups and EU-funded projects, for example, Inspire, UNICEF, GECO, and GenPort, and will thus also bring in an EU perspective on these issues, which I think is very valuable for us. Today, Anke will speak about why universities need to improve their responses to gender-based violence in academia. Anke, very warm welcome to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bonto, and thank you very much for inviting me to this series. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and I'm starting with sharing my screen. Let me have a look. I think this, no, this one. And I go into presenters mode. And I hope that worked out and you can see that. Okay, very good. So yeah, again, thanks a lot. And also for organizing this whole series. Actually, it's super, super interesting. And also looking into intersections, super important these days. So the question, not a provocative one, and eventually some of you have heard about this research from the UNICEF project already. But still, it's a burning question. Why do universities need to improve their responses to gender-based violence in academia? It's still something that is not finished, not a finished business, even though equality, diversity, and inclusion strategies of universities often claim that they guarantee or can guarantee in any way equal participation for all people, irrespective of their gender, of their sexual orientation, whether people have disabilities or not. Even though universities claim through their EDI policies that they're prepared to prevent and address discrimination when it takes place, including harassment, this is not the case. We know that it's not the case. And in the context of the Me Too movement, the societal awareness of sexual harassment has changed from a far-reaching normalization to a behavior that is no longer acceptable. And that moved somehow the discourse, including in the workplace, including in academia, at least in some places in Europe. But still, university leadership very often treats gender-based violence and discrimination incidences as isolated events, and that's wrong to do. And while every single case is one too many, the gendered social and organizational norms interact and work as power structures in higher education, and they perpetuate a very loud silence around gender-based violence, including intersectional violences. Looking at gender-based violence as isolated cases that places the vulnerabilities at the individual level only, and that's something that needs to be addressed. So the challenge here now is to address vulnerabilities and to acknowledge them, but not to frame vulnerability at the individual level only, but really to recognize the systemic implications relating to power and relating to structures, including in academia. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. And the research of the UNICEF project goes into that direction. So what we still see today is that gender-based violence is very often inaccurately understood as an isolated event, as something like a personal or private problem between individuals, something that is identified or categorized as wrongdoing by anyone who sees it, something that the institutional rules effectively do prevent, and something that is easy to stand up to, which is all not the case. when I talk about gender-based violence in the context of this UNICEF project, we defined gender-based violence along the lines like the Council of Europe defined it, which says it's any type of harm that is perpetrated against the person or group of people because of their factual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, or gender identity, or violence that affects persons of a particular gender disproportionately, meaning that it's not the people in that situation that need to make the causal link that this is gender-based violence, but the proportionality could also be an indication that it is and can be categorized as gender-based violence. So, and to investigate the situation in academia, including the prevalence estimates and the consequences of gender-based violence, we conducted a multi-level and multi-site study of organizations in 15 countries. This project included a large-scale policy mapping, an online survey in 46 organizations, 18 institutional case studies looking at the situation, what defines the responses, and 54 victim-centered interviews. And the aims of that project were to broaden the knowledge base that we have from the field, to develop a toolkit to further the practices that are in the field, and to formulate recommendations to policymakers. And I'm going to report from the quantitative study mainly, although I have to say, without the qualitative interviews and the case studies, we would not be able to really understand what the quantitative data is telling us. So it was really a wise decision to do this as a multi-level, but also method as a multi-method study. So the quantitative survey included staff and students. Staff is overrepresented in that study here, meaning that 43% of the respondents represent staff and 57% represent students. When it comes to gender identity, we have 30% of men responding to the surveys, 67% women, and 3% non-binary people responding. 81% of the survey respondents say they are heterosexual, and 6% associate themselves to an ethnic minority group, and 11% say they have a disability or chronic illness. We operationalized 6 forms of gender-based violence for this quantitative study. We took the 4 forms described in the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention. So it's including physical, psychological, economic violence, and sexual violence. And we added operationalizations of sexual harassment and online violence to our survey. So that study, that quantitative study, included also the effects of gender-based violence in terms of personal well-being and work and study effects. In most previous studies, actually before, focused mostly on sexual harassment and sexualized violence incidences. So how did we measure that in the prevalence survey? We operationalized each form of violence with a set of variables showing concrete experiences. For psychological violence, for example, this includes any act that causes psychological harm to an individual, including abusive comments, being interrupted, having one's speech impeded. And the time frame for these questions were the belonging to the institution, so to the current institution. And we also offered the prefer not to say item that blanked out any responses actually to the questions that were given before that. And when we look at the prevalence estimates by form of violence, we see that the most common form of violence was psychological violence, so microaggressions, putting down, verbal humiliations, etc., which 70% of the staff had experienced, and about half of the students had experienced, and about 1 in 3 people had experienced sexual harassment. So that included suggestive comments, questions about the private life, unwanted touching, kissing, or hugging. And among staff, 1 in 5 people experienced economic violence in their current employment. Students are more likely to experience physical violence and sexualized violence, with a significant difference between the sexes for these 2 forms of violence. And employees and students are equally affected by online violence, so via the organization's own platforms and communication channels. We also asked about the frequencies of these experiences of violence. And what we see is that the survey participants stated that sexual harassment and psychological violence in particular, as well as experiences of online violence, were made several times. Also, economic violence is also more likely to be experienced by the respondents multiple times than just once, specifically for the employees. And in addition to these, I'm sorry, I have to go back once more. Sorry, there's one more point. So in addition to the repeated experiences of the same form of violence, we find evidence for multiple forms of violence, so experiences of various forms that are violence that are connected. So for example, of the 4% of students who had experienced sexualized violence at the university, only 0.4% say they were not additionally affected by sexual harassment. And that's an important point I just wanted to make before coming to various groups of staff here. So let's have a look at the reported prevalence rates amongst different groups of staff. So here on this slide, you see the average rate of violence in the gray bar, and the little pink dot represents the reported prevalence rates of cisgender heterosexual men, which is below average rates in all of the forms of violence that we asked for. So, for example, 36% of the employees surveyed, they say they have been sexually harassed while they have been working with the current employer, so the current university or research institution. And there we find clear differences in the prevalence rates between the groups, meaning 44% of women, of people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or queer, and people with disability or chronic illness report experiences with sexual harassment in the context of their employment. So all of them, 44%. And among non-binary people, this applies to 45% even. And among those who say they associate with an ethnic minority group, it's 39%. So all of them above the average. And among the heterosexual cisgender men who do not report to have any disability or chronic illness and who do not identify as belonging to an ethnic minority group, it's 22% experiencing sexual harassment. So there are large differences in the range of experiences people make. When we look at the consequences, so and compare between, again, it's staff data, and we compare between those people who say they have made experiences of gender-based violence and those who say they have not. We can see clear and systematic differences between these 2 groups. So, and a larger proportion of those affected by violence report irritability, tension, as well as emotional exhaustion and feeling of being drained. Just one example. And it's not only well-being, but it's also work-related consequences that we see among staff. So the respondents assess their satisfaction with their employment situation much more negatively when they have experienced gender-based violence. And among those who have experienced violence, it's more than half of the respondents say that they feel less productive in their job. And about 4 out of 10 people affected by violence say they have considered leaving academia, and they had to stay away from work. They withdrew from their colleagues. They have tried to change the job or try to change the job, or even within the institution. So talent does leave academia because they experience bullying and harassment. And people who are subject to abuse very often do not feel taken seriously, and they isolate themselves from colleagues. They feel they cannot file a complaint without the risk of retaliation. So let's have a look at the reporting rates. So who reports incidents? Overall, we have 13% of the respondents who say they had experienced one of these 6 forms we asked for, and they have reported it to supervisors, counseling centers, complaints offices, or other bodies. We don't see any significant differences in reporting between the genders, but there are striking differences between the groups of employees and students, meaning we see 23% of staff say they have reported, and only 7% of the students say they have reported an incident. So, and the results suggest that for the subgroup of academic employees, the proportion of reports increases steadily with the level of professional academic position. So the higher the academic position is, the more likely it is that people do report and contact counseling services and complaint structures, which leaves some people in a more vulnerable and actually more silent position, which is definitely a problem, you might agree. So the reasons why violations are not reported are varied. Responses indicate that there's uncertainty about the interpretation of the seriousness of what happened and whether something qualifies as something that can be reported, and also uncertainties in recognizing a violation really as violence. Very often behavior is perceived as ambivalent and not really directly perceived as violence. So, and even if there is an event that is clearly recognized as a violation, there are still more reasons not to report and to be silent because of a lack of trust in the processes of the organization or concerns about retaliation. Affected people often choose the strategy of silencing themselves to protect them from to protect themselves from social isolation, from further deliberately harmful reactions by the perpetrators, and also from a loss of control during the complaint procedure. Self-silencing is particularly common when there is a high real or perceived power imbalance between the perpetrator and the person experiencing violence. So, and also when abusive behavior is considered as normal, this is also one mechanism that keeps people self-silencing, or when the institution is not trusted to handle incidents fairly, in a fair way. So we also, in the quantitative study, we also asked, how confident are you in your institution's ability to intervene? And here it's again data from staff. So the level of confidence depends on the experiences of the people. So while a majority of people people who have not say they have not experienced violence, 72%, if you count these two together, say they have confidence in the institutional ability, but they have not experienced any mechanism, and they say they have not experienced any kind of gender-based violence we have asked for. This is in very stark contrast to these employees with experiences of gender-based violence, who say, so it's 55% saying they don't have much confidence or are no confidence at all in the institution's ability to intervene competently. So as I mentioned in the beginning, gender-based violence is not an isolated event. It is in a framework and under certain conditions, actually, in which these cases and series of cases take place. Not everyone would instantly identify or categorize this as wrongdoing. And the ambivalence, sometimes ambivalent on purpose, leaves the victimized person with the need to judge the social situation and to speak up for their own needs. And institutional policies need updating and to be worked into practice effectively in order to better the situation. The psychological, social, professional, and financial cost of defending oneself against violations, including filing a complaint, are shouldered by those who are affected. The factors influencing a career in size go far beyond the actual employment contract. So a career thrives on professional networks and on numerous factors that depend on informal institutions. So the harm that is done really affects not only people, it affects universities, it affects science and knowledge making itself. And these are all good reasons why why universities should really step up their policies. I compiled some references, and of course I do thank you for listening, and I think I can stop sharing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anke. Thank you for sharing these super important insights with us and really providing this detailed and also intersectional data on what is going on at universities. And also already pointing out, as you said, that there is a very loud silence, as you were saying, around sexual violence and gender inequalities. And I think that will relate quite well to what Ea will also be sharing with us. So again, thank you, Anke, and I'm looking forward to come back to you when we come to the discussion. Welcome, Ea. I'm happy to also introduce you. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Ea Utoft to this webinar, and I guess to also welcome you back into the Danish context for today. Ea has a PhD from Aarhus University, and I actually remember when Ea's PhD came out, I was still in the middle of writing my PhD thesis, and I was very inspired, I have to say. Ea has done a lot of important work on sexism in the Danish context, and she is now an assistant professor of gender and diversity studies at Radboud University in the Netherlands. Her background is in feminist organization studies, and her work is primarily focused on inequalities in academic settings, with her published work concerning different manifestations of inequalities for different groups of academics. And today, Ea will share with us an input on the unspeakability of sexism in Danish academia as epistemic injustice. Ea, thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Bantu. Thank you, Molly and Liu, as well for the invitation. Let me see if I can get the screen going. Are we good?
One moment. Yes, perfect.
Okay, let's see. All right. Yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm really happy to be part of the webinar, the session today, and this conversation. Just one sec, let me get this going properly. Yeah, I think we're there. Okay. So in my short talk today, I'll argue that we cannot address persistent gender inequality in academia without addressing questions of epistemology, including how the dominance of positivism makes gender inequalities, sexism, sexual harassment, and misogyny largely unspeakable. When I talk about epistemology, I mean our theory of knowledge, that is, what we know and how we think we know it. So I also, just briefly before I begin, want to mention that there are ongoing strikes this week here in the Netherlands against these devastatingly huge political cuts to the budgets of higher education. So I'm just sending a bit of solidarity out there to my colleagues, including those at my own university at the pickets today. So although these cuts are done under the guise of efficiency measures, there's also, I believe, something more sinister at play, namely political opposition to the presumed so-called wokeness at universities. And so in that sense, it also relates very much to what we're talking about here today. Okay. So in my talk, I'll present 3 claims. One, that gender inequalities remain unspeakable in today's academia, which is a product of dynamics that are specific to the academic context. And 2, the unspeakability of gender inequalities in academia constitutes an epistemic injustice, and I'll explain what epistemic injustice is and why it's a fruitful lens through which to interrogate the persistent gender inequalities in academia. And finally, 3, in order to tackle persistent gender inequalities at Danish universities, we need to also address epistemic injustice, or at least, I believe, pay attention to it. So I'll start by introducing the concept of epistemic injustice, but I also just want to briefly mention that I will, well, in my final slide, I have a QR code that will take you to a Google Doc with all the referenced as well as related literature. But Bunty or Molly, maybe you can also share the link with the participants in the chat. Thank you. Okay. So the term epistemic injustice was coined by Miranda Fricker as an injustice done to somebody in their capacity as a knower. So following, for example, Heidi Graswick's work, epistemic injustice in science can happen in a variety of different ways. It can, for example, happen when certain people are disqualified as researchers and excluded from science. It can happen when research itself or certain kinds of knowledge is disqualified as not proper science or not proper knowledge according to standards defined by dominant groups. And it can happen when certain people's perspectives are not deemed worthy of scientific studies. That would be usually marginalized groups in some way, so that they don't have scientific knowledge or theoretical concepts through which to make sense of their lived experiences. And this latter form is what is known as hermeneutical injustice. But hermeneutical injustice can also be identified in cases where concepts and theories are in fact available, that is, they exist, but the context hampers individuals' use of these concepts, or what we call epistemic resources. It can also be that even if marginalized groups use the available epistemic resources, these resources are not given uptake by those who are dominant in the context. And that means that they're not given legitimacy or they are entirely rejected. The epistemic resources I'm interested in today are sexism, sexual harassment, misogyny, discrimination, inequality, unfairness, and injustice. And finally, another form of epistemic injustice that's important here is testimonial injustice, which occurs when prejudice causes a hearer to give less credibility to a speaker's words, given some aspect of that speaker's identity. For example, when women's testimony is not seen as credible because they are women. So before I will show you how these epistemic injustices can manifest empirically, I want to take a step back and give you a few examples of research that shows the unspeakability of gender inequality in academia, or using the terminology I just introduced, how the academic context hampers or rejects individuals' use of available epistemic resources such as sexism, inequality, injustice, and so on. The first example that I want to show you is Katrine Eland's article from 2001. Her analysis shows how gendered barriers to academic careers and the skewed gender distribution across the hierarchical academic job categories are reinforced, legitimized, and naturalized in discursive negotiations around meaning. Her analysis, among other things, shows how continued beliefs in the myth of meritocracy construct gender inequality as unintelligible or a void problem, a non-problem, because academia, of course, gives the same conditions and opportunities to everyone, because scientific practice is perceived as inherently neutral. In Eland's research, gender inequality as a problem is, in other words, unspeakable. That is, this framing was not given uptake by her research participants, which can be seen as a hermeneutical injustice to those who may in fact experience it as such. In my own PhD dissertation, I used the theoretical perspective post-feminism to unfold how gender inequality becomes a void problem. Post-feminism is essentially the belief that gender equality has been achieved, and for that reason, we don't need feminism anymore. In my PhD research, I argued that post-feminism is particularly salient in the Danish context, when the belief in the successful achievement of gender equality and the simultaneous repudiation of feminism are taken for granted. This leaves only very particular epistemic resources available to make sense of gender disparities, such as the attrition of women in science. This is when gender essentialist arguments often enter the picture, such as the view that disparities are a product of natural differences between men and women, such as different interests and levels of ambition. What is perceived as natural, again, does not constitute a problem. In a post-feminist context, alternative epistemic resources, including sexism, discrimination, and injustice, will not be given uptake due to the presumed successful achievement of gender equality. Sexism and discrimination against women are seen as issues of the past that have no relevance in the present. Last year, this book came out. It's based on 170 interviews with social science researchers in Denmark, about 60-40% men and women. I think you get my point by now and can imagine where I see the link between epistemic injustice, unspeakability, and what in their book, Järvinen and Micmaia called gender inequality as a taboo. A taboo being something that is not socially accepted to say, and violating a taboo can imply some sort of social risk. I'll get back to their empirical findings in a bit, but for now I want to highlight the author's reflections on what risk they experienced when interviewing especially men for the book, when they asked two presumably benign questions, namely, how would you explain the low share of women professors, and have you observed situations in which men and women were treated differently? The authors describe how, when the topic of gender was introduced, otherwise pleasant interview interactions would turn uncomfortable, awkward, even hostile. Although Järvinen and Micmaia personally find the underrepresentation of women professors a problem, they believed the formulation of their questions was neutral. To present something as a problem, which again the authors don't feel that they did, seems to be the same as to advocate for something to be done to solve that problem. And the male interviewees equated solutions with, in their view, unfair preferential treatment of women. In the eyes of the male interviewees, the authors, as women professors themselves, came to represent women's interests in academia. That is, the authors were seen as biased, whereas the men were able to present themselves as defenders of fairness, meritocracy, and neutral quality standards. And this allows me to segue on to the next part of my talk. Namely the question, what is it about the academic context that makes gender inequality unspeakable? So in addition to the myths of meritocracy and post-feminism, I'll focus on one factor, namely the dominance of the positivist research paradigm. So in a recent paper that I'll return to in a moment, Thor Haugaard Frederiksen and Meiling Poulsen write that positivism is not a universal position, nor are there agreements among social researchers about its scientific merits. However, positivism has obtained a privileged position for historical and political reasons. So let's just have a brief look at that historical perspective. In her book, Har videnskaben køn, Bente Rosenbæk emphasizes that science must be understood as a historically situated social and political practice. She describes how the modern sciences, including medicine, biology, and anthropology, emerged in the 1800s by defining who got to be researchers and who were othered as research objects. For example, womanhood and femininity for white women was equated with biology and naturalized, which legitimized doctors and scientists of the time to dictate social rules for them, such as the so-called overexertion theory, namely that women should not study because it was believed that the ovaries could not evolve at the same time as the brain. So this was the scientific arena that Danish women, spearheaded by Nielsine Nielsen, the first woman to be admitted to a Danish university, were first allowed into after 1875. Until then, white women of the privileged classes had been confined to the home sphere, and because of that, women were considered inherently subjective compared with men who are allowed to be part of social, cultural, political, and scientific life, and who could therefore, it was assumed, be objective. So this way, the sciences that had created womanhood and femininity, as these were culturally understood, then through the demand for objectivity, legitimized the exclusion of women from academia. And the demand for objectivity, I believe, is still central to the exclusion of women from academia today. Objectivity is, of course, a central positivist, perhaps the central positivist scientific quality criteria, alongside other aspects such as the empiricist rejection of the existence of any underlying structures and the application of strict quality or strict criteria as to what counts as evidence. For example, that personal testimony can only ever be seen as anecdotal. In their paper, Thor Hauge Frederiksen and Meiding Poulsen argue that understanding the dominance of positivism, and I quote, helps us to understand the claim that feminist research is not science. And importantly, I would argue and would expand that to include that any feminist knowledge claims are not proper knowledge. So what do I mean when I say feminist knowledge claims? I mean claims about the pervasiveness of sexism and sexual harassment in academia, claims about continued discrimination, any claims, in short, about gender inequality as a problem. In the following, I'll give 4 examples of what it can look like when feminist knowledge claims are rejected. In other words, when both hermeneutical and testimonial injustice around gender inequalities in academia play out. First, the epistemic injustice of gender inequalities in academia is really a tale as old as time. So Bente Rosenbeck writes, Nielsine Nielsen wasn't simply an academic pioneer. She was also able to see these academic systems' patriarchal structures, and she didn't mince her words in her memoir. When the book was first published in 1923, the publisher intentionally left out those parts of her recollections that he perceived as too partial. This, I would argue, can be seen as an example of hermeneutical injustice because her analysis of academia as characterized by patriarchal structures, her feminist knowledge claim, did not have uptake by the dominant group in the context. They were made unspeakable in a very literal sense as they were deleted. We also see testimonial injustice here because her gender subtracts from her credibility as a knower, even of her own experiences in her own memoir. The next, and of course much more recent example, comes from Køn og Karriere i Akademia. The interviewer asks, have you observed situations in which men and women were treated differently? Fleming, a senior male researcher, replies, no, but I think I might be a bit tone deaf in that respect. It is also a question of different research interests. My field of research is characterized by advanced theories and hardcore scientific thinking. I've tried to recruit some female PhDs, but they are more interested in other things. So Fleming here rejects having observed gender discrimination against women, but recognizes that he may not be able to identify it even if it did happen. He immediately deflects the question and constructs and naturalizes a gendered knowledge hierarchy. Women's presumed inherent lack of interest in advanced theories and hardcore scientific thinking seems a plausible explanation for why he has not been able to recruit female PhDs. The epistemic resource sexism is not given uptake, and women academics are presented as naturally interested in lesser academic pursuits. The next example is about John. To the same question of whether he had witnessed situations in which men and women were treated differently, John answered hesitantly, no, I don't think so. Nothing that was clear enough for me to catch. It's more likely the other way around, you know. Women are sometimes favored, he continues. Yes, actually, I've seen it the other way around, that there is a large pool of men and we have not always chosen the best qualified candidate due to diversity considerations. So John does not outright reject the possibility that gender discrimination against women may occur. However, he flips the question on its head and claims that reverse discrimination frequently happens. So I highly recommend this part of Järvinen and McMeyer's analysis, in which they convincingly show how the recruitment and promotion of women is problematized by men as a general rule as undeserved. In this epistemic framework, men are entitled to jobs and promotions, whereas hiring women will inevitably be at the expense of quality. My final example comes from an ongoing collaboration which I'm currently doing with Signe Vogel, based on her empirical work in the Danish academic setting. I know it's a bit of a long quote, but essentially it concerns the unequal distribution of academic service work between men and women academics, which is a very well-established phenomenon in the literature. So what I want to show here is how Sarah, a professor, has internalized the rejection of feminist knowledge claims to such an extent that it undermines the credibility of her own experiences, even to herself. And this expresses itself through a number of caveats in line with positivist research criteria. Basically, she is hesitant to generalize. She even apologizes, and she calls her reflections philosophizing, and finally adding the double I think at the end. So Sarah's struggle to assertively articulate her own experiences as inequality is a hermeneutical injustice. We might even claim that Sarah suffers a double hermeneutical injustice because of her inability to recognize this very struggle as a form of gendered epistemic harm. So why does it matter? Well, first of all, we cannot solve a problem we cannot name. So the fact that epistemic resources like sexism, sexual harassment, misogyny, and injustice are unspeakable is evidence of and contributes to the perpetuation of the problem. And this is what looking at gender inequalities within academia through the lens of epistemic injustice can show us, because women are rejected as knowers of the social worlds they inhabit, as well as of their own experiences. And it's not hard to imagine the potential adverse spillover effects this may have in terms of how or whether women academics can be seen as scientific knowers. It also shows us how sexism is in fact inherent to scientific practice historically and today. So paraphrasing again Thor Hauge Frederiksen and Meiling Poulsen, we can say that the positivist rejection of feminist knowledge claims constitutes an attempt at gatekeeping science. That is, as feminist knowledge claims constitutes a transgression against the patriarchal norm in academia, mobilizing positivism becomes a strategy to defend the status quo. And so that's why I claim that we cannot tackle gender inequalities without also addressing epistemic injustice, including these knowledge hierarchies linked with the dominance of positivism in mainstream science and academic education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ea. Thank you for bringing these important and very timely points into our conversation. I would say let's jump right into our discussion, because we certainly have a lot to talk about. Again, for our audience, you're super welcome to also contribute your questions through the Q&A, and we'll try to take them in as they come. The question I think I would like to start with is, why universities? And now this sounds like a very broad question, but what I mean by that is, what is it about the context of universities that makes it so likely for sexism and gender equalities to persist? The Viva report, for example, refers to how formal and informal hierarchies interact, the precariousness of working conditions and short-term contracts, these ideas around competition, excellence. Ea, you also mentioned meritocracy, as contributors of making higher education a particularly fruitful context for sexist discrimination. Maybe I'll start with you, Anke. Is there something in your research and your data that can tell us a bit more about the particularity of universities as a context where problems of discrimination and inequalities are so pronounced?
Yes, what we see is actually in not only our data, but in previous studies as well, the things that you just mentioned. There's a lot of, so the working conditions and the kind of the profession of a researcher is so dependent on access to data, access to infrastructures, informal promotion and support mechanisms. It depends on, it's highly precarious. I'm not sure how many percentages of the positions below the professorship in Denmark are people are working on temporary contracts. Actually, in Germany, it's more than 80%, and in many other countries, it's the same situation. It has increased in the last year. So from switching positions when they are replacing staff, actually switching a position from an indefinite contract to temporary contracts. It has a lot to do with dependency, formal and informal dependencies, and that makes academia a very particular place to work in, a place to study, because of these very high and dependencies, and it's not only restricted to one employer or one university, because academia is global. It's a network. It's you never know if you complain that the professor you're working with harassed you. You never know how many people that person knows, and who knows about that story, and if you're like socially already dead or not, right? So that makes it a very risky thing, specifically for young researchers.
And I found that very interesting to see in your research, as you were just saying, that the higher or the lower of a position you have, the more precarious your position is. It's not only that you're more affected by it, it's also less likely that you feel comfortable to speak up and to say something and to feel like you will be believed, which I guess also relates, Ea, to the point you were making about who is seen as a credible producer of knowledge or of sharing their experience and being believed in that. I was kind of thinking when you were speaking, Ea, that often there's this argument there is no sexism and discrimination at universities because here we're also educated. You're almost turning that around and saying it's exactly because of the way or the role that education and knowledge plays in universities, and because not all knowledge is accepted as knowledge, that universities are places where sexism and discrimination happens. So I was wondering, would you say that this unspeakability of sexism is a particular problem in universities?
Yes, I would believe so. I think it's more pronounced, at least. I could say. I think it relates to scientists' sort of many scientists' self-image, in a sense that, like, if we would not be able to be objective as like the golden standard of what we do, then who would be able to be objective in assessing the quality of work and assessing the qualifications of the people who apply for jobs, and we assess and promotion and hiring procedures, right? So I think it speaks to first of all, having to to accept the fact that these things exist will require some uncomfortable looking in the mirror that I don't think that everyone would be able to or be willing to do. And maybe I could add one thing to what Anke was also saying. So there's, of course, like you said, the relationship of dependency built into supervisory relationships, but also with increasing internationalization, international people are even more vulnerable. Why? They have invested their whole lives in moving to another place, right, and trying to build an existence there, and are more depending on that working out, right? So that leaves less space for voicing when things are not the way that they should be, for example, in a supervisor relationship. And I was also thinking about in the literature, there's a term called the passion trap, and I think lots of us who work in academia will recognize that, which is that we're so invested in our work that I think we internalize because it matters to us at a personal level in different ways, whether that be we're interested in protecting the planet in terms of climate crisis, or it's social justice related issues, but it matters. It becomes personal. And so I think lots of us also internalize a belief that we should be grateful. We should be grateful for the opportunity to be doing the work that we're doing, and that then that may also have, require that we have to sometimes swallow some bitter kind of a bitter pill that comes with that in a very competitive and occasionally very toxic working environment.
Absolutely, and I would add especially those who are not by default expected to be at the university or to belong to the university should be extra grateful to be there even when it's difficult. Which I think links to these questions of intersectionality that I also that both of you already spoke, and I wanted to pick up on that. Of course, within then the university system, if we zoom in on that, there's still different groups who are differently affected. We know, and you also shared this in your research, Anke, that queer women and non-binary people, also women with ethnic minority background, you added now also international staff are at a higher risk of being harassed and discriminated against. From your experiences of doing this kind of research, what is there that we can do to avoid that? We know these things, we know of these intersectionalities, but then still so often I think we end up talking about sexism and gender inequalities as a women's problem and assuming that it is a problem for white, able-bodied, cisgendered women primarily. And overlooking a lot of other groups of people who are also affected by different forms of sexual violence and harassment. How do we make sure that we also address this in the way that we research, in the way that we speak about it, but also maybe what is challenging about that?
Very difficult question. But I mean, so the first thing is that we cannot put the burden on people that are experiencing marginalization, who self-silence, who experience being silent and also not to be heard and not to be listened. So that means these people in academia who are white, not queer, etc., they need to acknowledge that there is systemic racism, that there is systemic transphobia, queer phobia, etc., and misogyny, and all these injustices I talked about. These need to be acknowledged, to be built in how we develop knowledge, how we work with one another, and it needs to be reflected actually by. So it's not an easy answer. It's about values. It's about work ethics. There are many, and it's about structures that can be changed or need to be changed, like politically. All of these, like, little bigger or smaller elements that could contribute to actually how we think to and kind of try not to other people, so make them feel alienated in the context they work in. It's our responsibility to do that.
Yeah, I've recently been working on universities' complaints procedures and reading into literature about how they most oftenly don't work very well. But I would say that it's super, super important to have professionalized reporting systems in place with people involved as confidential advisors, psychological advisors, legal advisors who have specific social justice related knowledge, right? So that when they are confronted with a person who is not white and who is queer in some way or of color and who's had experiences, for example, with sexual harassment, they will know how that specifically manifests for a person of those characteristics, which is unique and will look differently than, for example, if that person, that advisor, is a white woman. So that person can know, can recognize those specificities and put them in context of not only sexism, but also other systems, inherent systems of oppression. So I think the procedures are increasingly important, but also the people we put in those systems. It's not enough to just hire a researcher, an associate professor who has previously been on the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. That person can be knowledgeable, but they can also be just kind of coming at it from their best intentions with no academic knowledge of these topics. And I see that more and more as really crucial to making anti-discrimination efforts in the university function better.
So as I understand, both of you kind of not having these perspectives as an add-on. So we do something and then at the end we add these perspectives, but really taking it as a starting point, both in who is part of the reporting, but also who's part of a research project, what kind of research are we taking into account. And I just wanted to also pick up on that point a little bit, because you both also talked about doing research and how we do research. And I guess also who is part and what perspectives are part of that. On the one hand side, we have your point, Ea, about the dominance of positivism making some forms of gender equality unspeakable. And I guess we could also see that from an intersectional perspective of some forms becoming even more unspeakable in the sense. And at the same time, we do see that such large mixed method studies with quantitative data like the UNICEF study, they are super important, especially when they can also then show us some intersections, as you were showing us, Anke. Because they make issues of discrimination, they make it easier to see it, to acknowledge it, to understand it, but I guess they also make it easier because we're so used to this positivist framework. So I'm just wondering, how do we bring those 2 points together, or those 2 perspectives?
Well, I can maybe kick us off. Certainly, it's interesting that in the time I've been occupied with these questions, I see a big difference in how different faculties or researchers and staff in different faculties at the university relate to these topics. So I believe, in my experience, people who are, for example, in the natural sciences, where the absence of women, for example, is so pronounced, especially in some fields, that it's like it's an inevitable fact for them that there's something that's wrong, right? But in other places, and my experience is that this is like characteristic of the social sciences, especially where you think that there'd be a space for a plurality of methodologies and epistemologies in pursuing different kinds of knowledges, that the kind of the adherence and the adherence to positivist criteria and like the strong self-belief I talked about before in terms of objectivity is even stronger. I find it harder to talk with social scientists about this than with people in other academic fields, which I find really, really interesting. But yeah, so in terms of questions of epistemology, I think what really is striking is that I see also, so for example, intersectionality being applied in quantitative research sometimes, but exactly as this tool that can be picked up and put into something, then used, and then kind of put away again. And for me, coming as a feminist researcher specifically, that's not how I approach it, right? Like for me, intersectionality is a political standpoint. And for that reason, it cannot just be a tool. It is also an orientation to, for the research results to contribute to political intentions and goals, right? So, yeah, for me, it really is about creating knowledge that will contribute to furthering progress, ideally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Anke, please.
Yeah, so my experience is actually that it needs a lot of data. It needs a lot of different sources, different modes of doing research to be heard and listened to. So there have been studies in the past who surveyed the prevalence of sexual harassment in academia, and these results were like also super shocking, but at that point, nobody wanted to hear it. So these studies have been criticized, like methodologically, they have been devalued, etc., etc. And so I really strongly believe that quantitative and in this sense also positivist research results and data is necessary. And I said also in my presentation, I strongly believe that we would not be able to understand the findings without the qualitative context and the policy mapping that we have, and because that all is forming the whole picture. You cannot only look at one snapshot because this is what people are listening to. You need to have really the full picture, and I'm totally convinced. And I know many cases in which students searched for cases of abuse and sexual harassment in the university and presented that collection of cases to the leadership. They were not listened to. Then at some point someone said, yeah, okay, so we have to create a different data set, scientifically robust, and they hired an agency, so a research agency, to conduct more or less the same research that the students did before, because they were not believed. The results were more or less the same, and that took a long time before something really happened. And I think this is the disastrous here, that there is some credibility attributed to some ways of doing things and not to others, which do deserve the same credibility.
Yeah. And I guess we, on the one hand side, have to be strategic about using those that make us be listened to, and at the same time continuously have this critique of what is put into the foreground, who is being believed and who not. I have 20 more questions I could ask you, but I also want to make sure we hear a bit from our audience. So I would say maybe, Molly, let's open for some audience question, and then maybe I can come in with the final one towards the end. Do we have something in our Q&A?
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonto. And thank you both to Aya and Anga for your wonderful presentations. There's a lot of engagement in the Q&A. I'm going to try, for time's sake, to combine a couple of these questions so that we can try to get through as many as possible. So looking at Jenna's question and Christian's questions, Jenna says, thank you both for your brilliant presentations. My question is, to what extent the existence of gender equality plans, which are eligibility criterion for applying for EU Horizon grant schemes, has helped or has an unlocked potential to help to solve the inequality issues that you have mentioned, that are deeply rooted and deeply related to the legacy of science and science culture as such. And Christian is asking in a similar direction of how do our speakers view the influence of neoliberal management practices in universities in relation to gender-based violence and harassment? Have the implementation of these over the last 10 to 15 years increase or lessen these issues? I don't know, Anga or Aya, if you have any thoughts, or who might want to start.
I can start eventually. On the first question, how the gender equality plans criterion helped to address issues. I know that there has been an impact study conducted by the European Commission on the impacts of gender equality plans, and that criterion that was published, I think, like 2 weeks ago. I just got the information today and I hadn't had the chance to read it yet. So I recommend to look up the European Commission's publication portal and to look for that impact study. I'm also happy to share the link, which I, as I said, received this morning, and I hadn't had a look at it. I'm a bit hesitant because my perception, like looking at the field EU-wide and the interaction between the EU level and national levels, my impression or like fear was so far that this is a pure window dressing exercise without significant effects. And let's look at the report, what they find. Maybe there are effects that they can formulate. I'm not sure, and I hope that there are significant effects that help to address the issues and to give legitimacy to research also that we're doing. On the second question on the neoliberal, how does the neoliberal tendency come in? In my perception is that neoliberal dynamics are making it more difficult to talk about informal institutions. It puts not only the organizations, but people under pressure. Things need to be done, so promised before, done in a certain time frame, reported, etc., and very neutral. And it's not a neutral system. It's a masculine-dominated system that we're working in academia. So I'm sure there are effects. I know that there's a whole huge corpus of literature looking into the aspects concerning governance and neoliberalism in academia, and I don't remember any of that literature saying it had positive effects, despite gender equality plans being financed and gender, becoming a something that is like fundable project-wise still, but something that is relevant to funding, but still like on the ground. When we look at what we want to aim at, I don't remember any positive effects of that.
Yeah, I happily follow up on that. These are really great questions. So I think they speak to some things that I think about a lot, which is like symbolic action versus no action. And I'm kind of on the leaning towards the side I'd rather have symbolic action than no action. But for JEBs, obviously, I think the risk is that they become symbolic actions if they are only there to be ensuring compliance in order for researchers to get funding from the EU. Like the goal of having a gender equality plan should in and of itself be to improve gender equality at the university. So it's about the focus. It's what we see them as doing, right? And I think certainly from my perspective, having gender equality plans, and I'll know that Molly and Leo will be able to speak much more to this than I will, it allows us to systematize the work that we do on gender equality at the university. It certainly ensures that there is some attention to it and some degree of accountability in terms of delivering some kinds of results. And I think that's where the neoliberalization for me comes in, because it's about then how we measure those results. And neoliberalization is all about quantification and like easy output and like seeing, in that sense, seeing kind of easy results, right? Because that's what you can measure in numbers, and that's what neoliberalism likes, right? So is the focus to just create the numbers that look good, or is it to create systemic change? And I think neoliberalization, what it does is like inherent to what it does is depoliticization, right? Because the focus becomes on the numbers, not on systemic change. Yeah, that's probably what I wanted to add.
Thanks so much, both of you. I think following up on the conversation that we were having also earlier in terms of precariousness and who is especially disproportionately affected by these issues, by sexism, by sexual harassment, and talking about the especially the younger researchers. I wanna pull in Florian's comment question. They write, thank you very much to Professor Lipinski and Professor Utoft for these extremely insightful talks, and to everyone here organizing. I wanted to ask what we young researchers, who, as mentioned, particularly vulnerable for discrimination, but also in dire need for change. What can we do to fight discrimination, or at least sensitize our peers without explicitly having to depend on the goodwill of our supervisors and administrations? It can feel very daunting, even talking about feminism and the pervasiveness of patriarchy in our workplace to colleagues in the natural sciences, but it seems incredibly necessary, though it feels like there is no way to do so without negatively affecting our careers. And I want to tie Florian's comment here with the first one that came in, talking about the leaky pipeline. So what do we do with these issues? How do we talk about them without depending on the goodwill of others, which I think is a nice way of also putting that. And what can we be doing about this to be also simultaneously addressing the leaky pipeline?
My first thought was to the first question. And I think for us feminist organization research, this is a bad habit where I'll just like read some Sarah Ahmed, because that's a really good source of getting some context for understanding what goes on. So, for example, one of her classic books is about doing diversity work, and what she's saying is that for those who represent diversity, so to say, women, people of color, international colleagues, and so on, it falls upon us to do this work, which the university should be doing, right? We are researchers and teachers. We should be doing research and teaching, but as the university is not doing sufficient to make us included and retain us in our jobs, protect us in our jobs, then it falls on us to do it. So I just wanted to flag that it's important to get involved. I mean, maybe there are committees, maybe there are activist collectives to join, but also you are also there to do your job, and that is also super important to prioritize in a very competitive academic work. But then I would also recommend Sarah Ahmed's book called Complaint, which is also about like forming activist collectives where there is a space for you to say, to describe your experience of existing in the university in the words that you find appropriate. So find those safe spaces, and that can perhaps sustain you in a not super, in a very patriarchal, not super feminist organizational space as universities usually are. And you can think about actions that you can take together so that it doesn't become too isolating and falls on you individually, because that's not, that's too hard for anybody.
Thanks so much for that, Ia. Also for the reminder to read Sarah Ahmed. Anke?
Yeah, very similar. Actually, things I can say, become a feminist killjoy. So we all at some point decided, to become a feminist killjoy. But the thing is, I mean, the data is there, the research is there, the reflections are there. So eventually you know what to expect as a young researcher when you grow in academia and make your way through the pipeline. And we know also from research, for example, from Canada, as soon as you become a professor and get more visibility as a professor, the story doesn't end there, because once you are more visible, there are more attacks again. So yeah, increase resilience, network, find your safe spaces. The points actually, I noted down as well. So yeah, that's it. The system needs to change, but it will take a long time.
Thanks for that, Anke. Now, I mean, that's like talking a little bit more of those questions that we just had in. We're just talking a little bit more of, what can we do? And we also have a couple questions. We, the feminists, the people doing diversity work, et cetera, young, early career researchers. there's a couple questions also coming in of asking more about systemic change. So a question coming in of recommendations with regard to today's session of Let's Act. So kind of, but what I'm thinking of some more like systemically, or like how can the system act? What can we do to be pushing systems? And there's also a question coming in that came in from Sophie about what could policymaking on sexual harassment and gender inequality that is informed by intersectionality look like? Because I think that that's also important to take up now. Especially, we have the question earlier about the gaps, and now we're being pushed towards having inclusive gaps and intersectional gaps. So just thinking a little bit more of policymaking. What can we be? What does this look like?
Well, I guess like in terms of thinking about race, ethnicity, first and foremost will require that we hire some people of color, because I think that that's already not really happening too much, but certainly for those colleagues who are minoritized in different ways, we need to have those things in place already, and that's not a given that that's done already. But I think what I see when I look at policies is that they are products of compromise, that usually maybe a DEI officer writes a draft, and then it goes through various rounds of different stakeholders, leaders, maybe even goes to each faculty, and everybody is free to give feedback, and it becomes watered down more and more through each of these rounds of feedback, because obviously a DEI policy document is a political document, right? And I think we should hire DEI officers or DEI workers or gender equality workers with qualifications, as I said before, and leave policy writing on something that requires expertise to write those policies first and foremost. I don't see that happening, just like to clarify that, because universities are usually led by people who are not ready to stick their neck out on such political issues. But I would wish that this work was left to people who has that knowledge, because we exist and you exist.
Thanks so much, Ea. Anga, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we should not always point to like a central service unit in the university to solve all our problems, actually. I'm very much in favor of repeated actions, repeated awareness raising, repeated trainings, and also requirements, for example, in job advertisements for people who have responsibility for junior staff, that they need to have some training because it's a precondition to be recruited as a professor or as someone leading something and responsible for stuff. It will not go without being like distributed and carried by many, many people in the university.
I think I will jump back in here because we're coming towards the end, and I just want to ask you one last question. I'll ask you for a one-sentence answer, if that's possible, or a short one. But I just want to end with also asking, you've been doing this work for quite a while in different positions in different countries, and I know that it is challenging work. We are met with a lot of backlash and resistance, but nonetheless, you keep doing that work. So I guess also from, a self-interested position, is there something you can share where you say, this is what motivates me, this is why I still keep doing this fight? Maybe it's a specific example from the Netherlands or from Germany where you say, when I see this, it gives me hope to continue.
For me, actually, what really motivates me, it's actually the moving target. So we're dealing with moving targets. The system is developing, the ideas of equality are developing, what we understand is gender inclusivity, intersection. These things are developing. And this is actually that kind of keeps me going. Yeah.
Thank you.
For me, it's very much the students. We have such a demand for the teaching we offer at Radboud University on gender diversity related topics, and some of these students will go into university careers themselves, and I would wish that we could create change for them too.
Thank you both for sharing that. Thank you for also sharing your important insights and critical perspectives on what the problem is, the perspectives we need to look at that, but then also giving us some positive pointers of how we stay motivated. I will definitely remember both of those points. I think often when we have a moving target, it can feel like we never reach it. But on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that we are continuously reaching parts of that and we continue to push forward. Thank you so much, Anke and Ea. It was a pleasure having you and discussing with you. I'm very much, I'm taking very many things with you from you. Sorry, we're coming towards the end. I am taking a lot of things with me from your talk, and I'm sure so is the audience. Just for everyone to know, we will have 3 more sessions coming up with more important and interesting insights. Next week, Thursday, we will meet again at 2:30 p.m. Central European Time, and we will talk about anti-queerness and anti-transness in higher education. We will be joined by Dr. Irina Schmidt, who is a senior lecturer at Lund University in Sweden, and she will speak about mundane resistance to trans lives in academia and looking for hope in the cracks. So more interesting conversations coming up. For today, I really want to thank you again, Ea, and thank you again, Anke, for being here, for sharing your insights and for discussing with all of us. Thank you, Molly and Liu, for being here with me. And again, also a huge thank you to our audience for being here, for listening, for your participation and your question. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.